Welcome to Opportunity Costs. Join us as we dive into meaningful conversations that empower individuals navigating the complexities of divorce. Our mission is to provide insight, support, and practical strategies to help you make informed decisions during this challenging time.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Opportunity Costs. You know, most people, myself included, when divorce comes up, my mind it's almost like a knee-jerk reaction. It just goes to attorney, need a lawyer. I think it's something to do with the fact that human beings are selfish creatures by nature, and we're always trying to protect our interest. So what if that wasn't the case? What if you didn't necessarily need an attorney for a divorce? What if there was another way? And that is the subject of the conversation today. So guys, I think the best place to start would be, why do you think it is that most people have that assumption that they just need a lawyer to get divorced?
Well, can I start? I think it really kind of all goes back to how people needed to prove that to the courts way back when. I mean, way back, I say way back when, but it was really just more than 50 years ago. The first no-fault divorce was allowed. Up until 1969, you had to prove that your spouse was mistreating you, either through abuse, like domestic abuse, or maybe substance abuse. So it was basically in California in 1969, Ronald Reagan signed a law making divorce no fault, mostly because he wanted to run for president and he was divorced. And so it was very, very, it was a strategic decision.
How convenient.
Right? And so after that, the states followed suit. New York only made no fault divorce in 2014. So basically for all of these decades, states one by one realized that divorce was happening more often and that we didn't want people to have to prove that their spouse was awful. But up until then, you did. And I really believe that the reason divorce has always been so awful is because lawyers were trained in that adversarial way to prove that the other spouse was more wrong.
Where was your brain when I was taking my history exams in high school? Because I'm amazed you remember all that. That's impressive.
Or it's one of those things she just made up and knows no one.
Well, so I want to get some clarity here, because I've heard you say this before. So you're saying that prior to this time, you literally, if you were unhappy with your spouse, you couldn't just end things. You had to go through the courts. I guess that makes sense in terms of what we're seeing nowadays. With there is quite a lot of divorce. What is the divorce rate? It's over 50%, right?
Yeah.
So I guess back then it was more challenging. There was more obstacles, barriers to entry, and people just kind of stayed together, in many cases, miserably so. So that's probably a huge factor that contributed to the spike in divorce rate over the last 50, 60, 70 years, no?
Yeah, and I mean, also, the reality is that I think that it ended up in the court system because no one knew what to do with it. Like when business entities are separating, you need to go to the court to figure out how to separate something that was created. So I think when people started to want to transition out of their marriage into their next chapter, the only system set up to do that was the court system. And so I think lawyers really got divorced by default, really. And so I think that was part of the problem. And I think divorces, and I'll let John speak to this because he's a lawyer. Divorces really take on the personality of the professionals that you hire. And so if you hire an adversarial lawyer, you're going to have an adversarial divorce.
Yes. I think a lot of times with lawyers, or the chosen lawyers, it like attracts like. So a certain type of personality will subconsciously probably be attracted to a certain type of attorney to represent them. I think that most people are programmed to think that they need an attorney, that this has to be adversarial, or to Elizabeth's point, historically going back with other generations, people probably think, oh, you need a lawyer. You know, your mom or dad will tell you, you need a lawyer. You can't go at this without a lawyer because you're going to get screwed. And I think that's a big part of it, is just peer pressure, social influences, and what we're told make us think that we need a lawyer. But like everything in life, things evolve, right? And so divorce today isn't, to Elizabeth's point, what divorce was 50, 60 years ago. And a dissolution of a business, at the end of that business, no matter what the outcome is, those people don't really have to deal with each other anymore. In a family law dispute or divorce, a lot of times at the conclusion of the divorce, we still have to deal with our soon-to-be ex-spouse. We have children together. We run in similar circles. We're going to see each other out. There's all these things that are impacted by how we choose to get divorced now. And so I think things are changing. Things are evolving. They're just not happening as quickly as they should be. Because people still think, you know, if I ask my parent or I ask my friend, they're all going to tell me, oh no, you know, you need to be represented. You're gonna give up something. Your spouse is trying to pull one over on you. Meanwhile, if you ask that person who went through divorce, how did it go? They're probably going to tell you it was awful. It was one of the worst experiences of their life. Right? But their recommendation to you is to do the exact same thing. Okay.
You know, Jeremy, when you introduced it, you said, you know, you used the word to protect yourself, right? And I think that a lot of times the emotional parts of us sometimes make choices in the short term that don't work out in the long term. And so that need to protect yourself. And it's funny, John, when you said like attracts like, maybe in another podcast, we can talk about sort of the relationship parts of, I sometimes call it interlocking pathology in relationships, right? Someone who feels like they don't have enough of a voice probably hires someone with too much of one. And so if you're not feeling like you're going to get heard, you're going to go after the shark who's going to tear your partner apart. And that's probably a coming from a really scared and hurt and angry position, and yet not going to serve most people well in a relationship post-divorce, because they haven't learned how to cooperate with each other, how to communicate with each other. They haven't come up with solutions to problems. They've had two people duke it out for them. And then at the end of that process, they're left with a lot of probably tense and conflictual relationships.
I don't think that there's no learning in a traditional divorce, in the sense that you are giving your voice away to a professional who knows you but doesn't know you, right, in that way. And they are going to advocate for your needs and wants through their voice, not yours. And I think that when you go through a process like ours, where we're going to teach you how to use your voice in this new relationship that you're going to have with your former spouse. We're going to coach you into being able to speak up and say things maybe you wouldn't say. And so we don't want to be your voice. We want to help you find yours. And I think that would be the difference. I think that in a traditional divorce, the lawyer is going to be the voice of the client, to the point that the clients are not encouraged to speak. And I think in alternate dispute resolution, the whole idea is to have the soon-to-be exes learn how to talk to each other. So the goal is to be able to next level your relationship, even though it's changing. Like the goal is to figure out how to teach you how to talk to each other, how to work through conflict, because almost always if we're sitting in a room discussing divorce, that couple did not know how to have productive conflict. It was usually a mess. And so our goal is to help people do that.
Guys, are there certain types of cases that lend themselves more to what you do? Because I can imagine scenarios where there's just so much emotion involved and it's such a contentious battle that it would probably make sense to get lawyers to, because again, having a lawyer kind of takes the emotional out of the equation. What types of situations lend themselves best?
Exactly. Jeremy,
I love the fact, John, that you were the first one to
opposite. I think lawyers often create the emotion as opposed to extracting the emotion. I know for me, the cases that I think are not ripe for this are
end up being right. Yeah.
No. Are if there's some type of real abuse allegations, or there's something substance abuse or something like that. That changes the variables a little bit, that takes it outside of the control of simply a matter of communication and education and learning and finding a result. Though I think those are the types of things where you probably really need an attorney and someone else to get involved, and maybe a judge to help you, because there are things outside of the norm. But the reality is from a norm where it's just a lack of communication or a disagreement about valuation, or maybe a simple disagreement about a parenting issue. Those are all things that with professionals that don't need to be lawyers can be worked out themselves, in my opinion.
I have a question for Adam and John, both of you. When you think about like substance abuse or domestic violence needing the court system, I mean, don't you think that even the court system isn't really going to help? I think the reality is that you need to be able to take personal responsibility and be able to be self-reflective in order to come up with your own agreement. And I think with the abuse or the substances, I think it's a really hard thing for people to be able to do. So I don't even think that a judge or a lawyer necessarily will do a better job with a case like that. I'm just not so sure the person who's either suffering with or suffering from those situations has the ability to advocate for self or to make decisions. What do you guys think?
It gets sticky, so so for example, even domestic violence, I don't know that it is easy to come into sort of a process that is mediation based when there's such a significant power difference. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure. I mean, again, I'm not sure, to answer your question. And I don't think there's a clear-cut answer, but I think when there are issues of domestic violence or substance abuse, I don't know that both people are in a position to feel as equally empowered. And I'm not sure if there may be a need in those cases for at least some, maybe not a fully legally driven process, but some legal aspects to it, especially when there's kids involved in those cases. I mean, that's
so the legal checks and balances maybe that they can get offered by the court system. Yeah.
All right, John, tell me how I'm wrong.
No, I agree with you. I can recognize that lawyers and even judges are not necessarily trained in how to deal with those types of issues, right? And they're human, so the best they can do is usually try to rely upon the opinion of someone who is considered an expert in those things, or some independent evidence, unfortunately, like a police report. My concern from a mediation standpoint is I would never want someone to enter into an agreement under duress.
Yes.
And I would be nervous that if there is that dynamic between two people, that they may be entering into some type of an agreement that they don't actually want to do, or that they feel they have to do. And that part, from a professional standpoint, makes me uncomfortable. My goal, and I know all of our goals, is not just to help people stay out of court today, it's to help them stay out of court in the future. And so I don't think our goal is just to help people now or give them the perception that they have been helped and they're clear, but we haven't, they still are, I know in the back of my mind, are going to wind up in court in the future. And so there's a part of me that just almost wants them to deal with that at this point, and maybe get safeguards and internal controls involved to kind of help them as they proceed in life. And so that's why, at least for me, and it could be certainly different for you, because I don't have the background or the education or the knowledge how to help those people personally. And so, certainly without you guys, I wouldn't do it. And I would defer to both of you, if there was that type of allegation, whether or not it was the proper thing for us to be involved in. But for me personally, that's the type of thing I would look at and say, you know what, this is probably something that's better handled outside of the mediation process, at least initially.
When
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. Nope, go.
Ladies first.
So, what that made my brain start to think about was the fact that when people are using lawyers, I feel like the lawyers are taking on roles that they're not trained to do, like financial and emotional. And I think that, or they have to hire it out. So they either have to find professionals to weigh in on that, or they have to, or they play roles that they're not trained to do. Like, divorce is emotional and divorce is financial, but is it legal? The only legality I understand is the same kind of legality that you have when you go get a marriage license. Isn't it the same?
And I think that's part of the irony, right? In order to actually be divorced, you do need a legal document in order from a court recognizing you as divorced. But a lot of times, the lawyers themselves are not trained to deal with the financial or emotional issues, which brings us back to the beginning of this discussion. Then why do people go to lawyers when they're not even trained to be able to analyze the most important issues of the divorce? Well, it's because we've been programmed to think we have to, or we've been told, if you don't do this, you're accepting so much risk, right? And like most things in life, even if we're not thinking about it consciously, a lot of it comes down to our willingness to accept a certain level of risk. And so, for example, if you think about health insurance, right? Even though we know we're probably going to have to fight with our health insurance company if we submit a claim, when you look at it, you go, all right, it's going to cost me $1,000 a month or $1,500 or $2,000 a month. Compared to the potential risk of not having insurance, that's just, most people will say that if I can afford it, that's justifiable. I'm willing to take that risk on. And almost in every decision, when we think about, should I not buy this, we're contemplating the risk, we're contemplating money. In divorce, we're told you're taking on so much risk, but no one actually tells us what is the reward, what are we actually fighting over, right? We're so programmed to think that if you don't have lawyers, you're taking on all this risk. But the reality is, it's not like a premium you're paying, each month, a small premium. You could be paying tens to 20 to hundreds of thousands of dollars. And for what? Because you've never determined what is your actual risk. The attorneys don't sit down and tell you what is your risk, right? Most of the time. Good attorneys will, but a lot of times they'll just sit down and they're going to say, all right, the client comes in, how much is this going to cost? Well, if you go take this all the way through trial and we bill an average of $500 an hour, and it's going to be 100 hours per side, and you do the math and you figure out the calculation, but you better do that because you stand to lose a lot. You're taking on a lot of risk, right? And a lot of times no one actually talks to the client about what does that risk amount to. And most of the time it's less than what you're paying out of pocket, but no one helps the client understand that, right? And so that's one of my big frustrations with this discussion about, do we need lawyers? It's the same thing. You need to be educated so you can identify what is your real risk. Then look at what is it going to cost you, and then you can make a determination whether or not you really need to follow through with that, or what is the best process forward. But we kind of skip that step. In most things in life, we don't skip that step. We do that analysis. But for some reason in family law, we completely skip it. We just go right to, I need lawyers, right? Because so-and-so says so, or because, my friend says that I need a lawyer, and we just completely ignore it.
So, having worked with a number of lawyers in my mental health practice, John, and I'm curious if you see this in your peers and colleagues. I sometimes think that the lawyer's brain, whether it's born this way or taught this way, sometimes speaks to risks that are possible but not probable. And so they often bring to the table these things that are maybe not likely to happen, but they're possible. Sort of like, while there are certainly accidents that happen, they're often much less probable than they are possible. And I wonder if that kind of heightens clients going into sort of a divorce, kind of heightens their fear that they're talking about risks that are probably not going to happen, but they're put out there. Does that make sense?
100%. Right? Because what can you do? You can retain risk. You can pass the risk on. You could determine what level of risk you're comfortable with. And when people go in and talk with attorneys, a lot of it, one thing I hear a lot is, if I had a crystal ball, I wouldn't be doing this. Right? The last thing I would be doing is being a family law attorney if I had a crystal ball. Right? But to your point, that lack of certainty is what creates fear, and that fear is what creates litigation. And no one in family law theoretically can guarantee the outcome of anything. And so when a client comes in and they pose a question and they get an answer that isn't a firm yes or no, that makes them perceive risk to be even greater, because exactly what you just said. Is it possible? Yes. They don't even get to the next step of probable. They just stop at, is it possible? Well, yeah, it's possible. Of course it is. Right. But then they don't do the math of, well, how much is it going to cost me as a result of this possibility? And then compare it to the probability. Right? No one does that because it's against. And I'm not saying all lawyers are like this, where they make decisions based on their own self-interest, because the truth is they don't know the answer. But a lot of times I'm always nervous that an attorney, like the more uncertainty there is, the more litigation there is, the more money there is to make. Right? And if I'm billing, if I'm billing a ridiculous amount of money, what do I have to feel like I have to do? Just to appease my own conscience. I need to justify it. I can't send you a bill for $10,000, $20,000 unless I believe that I'm worth it, or I've convinced you that I am worth it. So what do I need to do to convince you to pay my bill? I need to convince you that that possibility and that probability is so high that this fee is justified. When in reality, when you extract the emotion out of it, and you do the probability versus possibility analysis you brought up, right? None of us almost in a normal state of mind would go, that's worth it. That makes sense.
And that's the normal state of mind. That's the issue. Sorry for jumping out of my seat. But like when your relationship is ending, you are not in a normal state of mind. You are terrified and traumatized and really, really disappointed. And so I think that the person that you have chosen to basically be your right hand or left hand if you're left-handed, but like that person that's going to be your support system is no longer going to be that person. And so you are already feeling really vulnerable and you are terrified that you're going to make the wrong decision. And so when your Greek chorus, when everyone around you is saying that you need to protect yourself and you need to make sure that that he or she doesn't take advantage of you again, like they might have done before, which is why you're sitting in this seat, you better make sure someone helps you out. And that someone doesn't know how you've lived your life, that someone doesn't love your children, and that someone isn't going to be there when the case is over. That's you. And so I think that when you're feeling this scared, this vulnerable and unsure, you want to turn to somebody who's going to say, I've got you. I'm going to take care of you. And I think that family lawyers wear that hat during consultation. And I think as the process goes through all of the different steps, things pivot and change. And now we have to teach. So the person they were when they went in for their interview and they said, listen, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to ask the right questions. I'm going to make sure that you are okay enough in this next chapter. Like now we're looking at things like the finances. We're looking at things like the children and the relationships. And now we're having to lean on someone that isn't going to say to the person necessarily, well, how do you get along with your ex when you're with the kids? How are you going to talk about the big decisions that we need to make as they grow up? Are you going to call me and have the lawyer negotiate it? No, you're not. You're going to have to figure out how to talk to them. We have to figure out how to problem solve, and we have to figure out how to compromise. Because in a marital settlement agreement and even in a parenting plan, you cannot think of every contingency. You have to be able to work with your soon-to-be ex. And like one example that I have, I was preparing for hurricane, I think it's at Irma, like years ago. And I'm like bringing in my lawn furniture and I'm like dripping in water and sweat and everything. And my phone is ringing off the hook. And I accidentally answered it because I like hit the button. And it was clients of mine who had a parenting plan and they were evacuating. And it was one of the parents' weekends. And the parent didn't want to tell the other parent when they were going because they weren't in good terms. And I remember sitting there with them and feeling just a sense of just dread. Because can you imagine there's this hurricane impending coming in at that time, and it ended up going, but at that time it was coming right for Broward County. And dad wasn't talking to mom about where he and kids were going to go. And so luckily for me, I had a relationship with both of them. I got them on the phone. We figured it out. They all went together. But that's not going to happen in a litigated divorce. It's not going to happen with people who don't have someone who's going to help them learn how to talk to each other, because you can't account for everything. And I think it's really important to know that you sign up when you get married and have kids. You are signing up to be connected to that person forever, like it or not.
I want to ask each of you a question. I want to go around the room. I'm curious. What, in your opinion, what's the main advantage of handling a divorce without an attorney? Obviously, there's a financial component about saving money, but that's obviously also not what it's about. So from each of your perspectives, what is the main advantage of handling this without an attorney?
So it's hard for me to pick just one, but I'll sort of piggyback off of where we were. For especially couples with kids, their relationship is going to last much longer than their court case. And when the legal process actually increases emotional conflict, increases tension, often creates even more resentment and hostility, that does not do a lot for future relationships. And so, using Elizabeth's example, you now have a couple who is going to struggle making a decision that probably both good relationships and common sense could handle if they weren't so pissed and angry with each other, and if they weren't so worried about what the parenting plan says, which, again, in another place, maybe we could talk about the fact that with a relatively good understanding of English, I struggle to understand legalese, and they are often written in ways that are a little more confusing than even my brain can handle. But the parenting plan should be something Elizabeth and I often say, we hope you put this in a drawer and never have to look at it again. That the two of you can make good common sense decisions, mutual decisions that are in the best interest of your family going forward, because we know things are going to change and there are going to be circumstances this parenting plan can't speak to. So from my perspective, one of the main advantages is actually creating a process that helps couples navigate their post-divorce family in a way that is much more beneficial for everybody involved.
I think that it has to do with the agreement, and the agreement, like piggybacking on what Adam said, like not understanding legalese, also just not understanding all of the nuance, in the sense that I feel like when I'm dealing with clients, and I do all the time, who used a litigation. And what happens at the end of litigation, and John could probably speak to this, is like at the very end, when you're kind of almost everything is agreed upon, there's always like a couple little issues that like gets people stuck. And silly things are decided at that time in order to, like, you know, but sometimes these silly things end up having long lasting impact. And so, like, for example, I have clients now, and basically they agreed to, they were at the divorce table, they had high school kids, and they were trying to negotiate college. And you don't have to pay for college necessarily, because your kids are adults. And so you don't, and so they were fighting over who was going to pay and how they were going to pay. And the lawyers are, you know, and he really wanted to say, I'm going to pay for our kids' college. I want to do that. I've always wanted to do that. And his lawyer didn't let him, because the kids were going to be over 18. And so, like, why in the world would that in any family be a good thing? To say, like, for the person who really wanted to make sure that their kids have an education, to not be allowed to do that because the law didn't say. So what I would say, the best thing is that you craft your own agreement that makes sense for your family, for your own moral compass, and then really just for you. That's right.
Choose your own divorce adventure.
100%.
You guys help author those tales.
So I would say I played devil's advocate on the school thing. And this is the beauty of our process as we talk through things. A lot of times, I think if I give a lawyer the benefit of the doubt, it's not that they're telling that person not to pay for college. They're simply saying, don't put it into an agreement and obligate yourself to do something that you're not legally obligated to do. If you are that good parent and you have every intention of paying for college, you're probably going to do it anyways. You don't need to put it into an agreement and now create a contractual obligation where one doesn't exist. However, most, as we talked about earlier, most of these items are either emotional or financial, which lawyers are not trained as experts to deal with. And so my feeling isn't necessarily, and I know the topic of this is why don't you need attorneys? For me, it's the process or the litigation process is backwards. You don't need attorneys at the beginning because they can't really advise you. They have no information. They have to do all this work to collect the information because there's less transparency in order for them to give you a legal opinion. They may need to hire an accountant. They may need to hire someone with a therapy background. They need to do all these things in order to actually educate you in the first place. And so this idea that you have to start with the attorney, I think, is backwards. Most people can get all their ducks in a row, get educated, and then they'll realize usually when they've got most of this done, they can get it across the finish line because they've been empowered, they've been educated. And in reality, they don't need to have that fight. The fight has been avoided. Therefore, the need for attorneys has been avoided. However, if you get 95% of the way done and you're only having a disagreement about the remaining 5%, all right, so you need an attorney. You've now defined exactly what are you fighting over. You've defined what your risk is. You understand the entire thing, how this can play out. Now maybe you want to go speak to an attorney to help resolve that remaining 5%. But to go to an attorney in the beginning makes no logical sense when you actually understand the way everything works. And a lot of times you can avoid even having to go to an attorney the entire time because most of us are reasonable, smart people who want to empower ourselves to make our own agreements because that will give us, that will power us into the future. With attorneys, what happens in this litigation process, we get so focused on who's right or wrong, right? We'll spend 6 months arguing over $100 issue and we lose sight of all of the big things, right? I think the sky is blue. I think it's gray. Okay, we're going to spend the next 6 months arguing over the color of the sky before we do anything productive. And we're going to spend all this money arguing over the color of the sky. And the point is, all of that can be avoided. But that's how professionals and attorneys make money. They argue over the color of the sky.
Yeah, but what do you say to someone who going into this is legitimately scared, right? Has concerns that if they don't protect themselves with an attorney, they're going to be taken advantage of, right? Because maybe whatever they're in a contentious relationship, whatever the case may be, right? Emotions are running high. What do you say to somebody like that to get them to be more open and comfortable going into this and not having to constantly be thinking about, am I protected?
Well, start off by gathering information, right? Maybe the norm is to be nervous, to be afraid, to think worst case scenario. But a lot of times as we educate ourselves and we gather that information, that knowledge empowers us, right?
Yeah.
And so the point for me, going to an attorney, it's a perceived comfort blanket. It's not in reality doing what you think it is doing. So the people who think they need to go to an attorney to protect them actually don't understand what's going on because it doesn't provide that level of protection.
It's almost like a false sense of empowerment, right? Like you go to get this person to represent you, you hire him, you pay the money, you feel all good and well about yourself, but they don't really know anything about your situation. Like you said, you got to do the research. Many times you got to bring in other professionals. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That really resonated with me.
It's right. Someone comes in and hires me in their divorce really quickly. Sorry. Right. Someone comes in and hires me and they have questions or issues related to a psychological aspect of their family or their children or something emotional. Right. who's better to actually help them and address the issue? Adam and Elizabeth or me, because I have a law degree? Not me. They're going to come to me because they think they need to talk to an attorney. I know jack shit about whatever they're probably asking me about. If you're asking me a therapeutic question or a question about people or how to deal with people or how to manage an issue emotionally in psychology or what is in the best interest of your relationship with your children or soon to be ex-spouse, what gives me the ability to answer that question more than Adam and Elizabeth? Nothing in reality. It's just what people are or have been told. Right? Oh,
Yeah,
you're
but the
you must know the answer. Oh, you're a judge. You clearly are so educated. You know how to answer that question.
to the process, Jeremy, when you said sort of like when you're looking to protect yourself, and I'm going to apologize up front to anybody who has a fear of flying, because I'm going to use that as an example. If you have a fear of flying and you get on the plane and that introduction is all about the things you should do in case the plane goes down, right? And they tell you about the oxygen masks coming down and putting on your seatbelts and look in the pamphlet for all the emergency exits. That does not do a lot to quiet the anxious brain. If that initial conversation was about how freaking safe these vehicles are and how they are built with a tremendous amount of redundancy in the systems and how they can travel through tremendous turbulence and stay in the air, that would do a lot more for calming the anxious brain than telling them what to do in the event of losing oxygen. And I feel like the initial conversations with attorneys often look more like the conversation about oxygen masks and not a lot about the education and information about the process and the system.
And why do you think that is?
So I'm pretty confident it's because of people who are going to potentially need to protect themselves from a liability standpoint.
Correct, right? So going back to possible versus probable, you're much more likely to get into a car accident than you are a plane accident, knock on wood, right? But if they don't give those disclaimers and those warnings at the beginning of every flight, what happens? And God forbid the plane crashes. Someone's going to get sued.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Even though none of those warnings, I always laugh. I don't laugh. It's not funny, right? But if you actually think about it, like talking about probability, if a plane is going down, what is the chance that any of that is actually going to help you? Like, look under.
Wait, we're gonna
right? Like, or I don't whatever.
It's so true, John. Like I mean, just to like jump on that, right? Like if you think about a conflictual divorce, like most divorces, no matter how hard they are in the beginning, and then over the course of the next couple of years after the divorce process is final, families shift back to an equilibrium that most of the time resembles what it was before. And it's only those plane crash type of relationships that are really disastrous. And that on the pendulum of like the little bell curve of relationships, that's just a very small percentage. So like a divorce case, like a litigated divorce case that goes to trial is a very small percentage of divorce cases in general. I think it's under 10% that actually go to trial. Most of the time, divorce processes will end in mediation over a very long period of time with a lot of professionals making a lot of money. And only a small percentage really needs a judge to weigh in. And similarly, like really over time, most families will shift into a new equilibrium that has conflict sometimes and problems sometimes, but only a small percentage of the time it'll be awful. So instead of giving away your voice, giving away your power, and giving away all your money, it's so much better to work with people who are going to help you find your voice, who educate you about what you have and what you don't have and how to split that all up, then hire people who are going to terrify you, like Adam's analogy that they do at the beginning of a flight. That's my feeling.
And it's not just about this divorce and the breakdown of this marriage. When you just go through it ordinarily, you often learn nothing about yourself or what you should do different. And we go ahead and we meet someone else and we get remarried and we end up reliving the exact same experiences because we haven't learned anything. I think when you go through this process in a different way without just the straight litigation route, and you take advantage of talking to someone like Adam and Elizabeth, just from a personal standpoint, you're going to learn things about you, yourself, and your marriage, and how you interacted with a particular person. And you're much less likely to make that same mistake in the future going forward. Whereas we don't learn anything in litigation, usually, right? We may learn a little bit indirectly, but the reality is it's you don't learn a lot about you lose this opportunity to learn a lot about yourself.
Yeah, I think so many people get involved with relationships and then ultimately have problems that lead to divorce. And in many cases, they're running away from themselves because we're just mirrors, right? And our partners often are reflecting the things they see in us that we don't like about ourselves. And we push that aside. And it all goes back to communication and keeping an open mind. And a lot of these problems, some of them can be worked out, through effective communication.
Yeah.
I think so.
So if someone's out there listening, and let's say they're on the fence, let's say they're going through it right now. Their relationship is struggling and divorce is on their mind. But they're hearing this podcast and they're thinking, this is interesting, but they're on the fence. They don't know, maybe they don't feel comfortable going lawyer free. Like what should they ask themselves before doing anything? What's a good question that they could pose to themselves?
So again, sort of talking about the future, what do I want my post-divorce family to look like? What do I want that to sort of feel like for me? Sort of like many years ago, a friend of mine, I was moving into a new place and I was struggling with how I wanted to design it and what I wanted in it. And she said, come up with 5 adjectives for how you want to feel when you walk in your new place. And I was like, that's brilliant. That was a great suggestion, because that helped me to know what I wanted that to look like. It was hard to sort of think about the future, but I was able to kind of put it in perspective when I thought about what I really wanted that to feel like. And then when you figure out what you want your post-divorce family to look like, to feel like, how you want it to sort of function, figure out what process is going to help you to get there the best way. And I'm curious, and I don't know, John, I don't know if the answer to this, but I wonder, of the people who go to attorneys, how many attorneys say to them, you know what, you really don't need me. Sort of like when I go, if I potentially think I have had a couple of orthopedic surgeries, if I think I need something done, I kind of want the surgeon to tell me how the surgery would benefit me, but I'd also want them to tell me what I could do to avoid surgery, right? Because there are consequences to surgery. I have less cartilage in my knees now. It kind of sucks. But there, I'm curious, and I don't know. Do attorneys typically educate clients to sort of not only the ways in which they could help, but in the ways in which they are totally unnecessary?
So about 88% of all percentages are made up. So to answer your question, I have absolutely no idea. Okay. I do know there are good attorneys who practice with a high level of integrity that I know that would sit down with someone and tell them, what are your risks, or this doesn't make sense, or you don't need me. I think that's the small the small percentage of them, right? Those are usually your best attorneys who have such a thriving practice. They can be honest. They don't need to tell you because they don't need your case. I think a lot of attorneys, either consciously or subconsciously, will not give that advice. But if I was, you talk about and you ask questions, what do I want my post-divorce family to look like? I think if I was thinking about it, I would think, what do I want my life right now to look like? And what do I perceive that to be? And then which process most aligns with what I want? Because most people I know don't want to fight. They don't want to argue. Most people say that they don't want this to drag out. They don't want to spend a lot of money, right? They know, they're smart enough to know that. They just don't know the alternative that will provide it. And they'll say, all I want is fair, right? Well, but they don't know how to define fair. And so that's where I think where we come in is we help educate people so that they can define what's fair and they can avoid a lot of this.
And
Talking about.
And what I would say is fair enough, good enough, because fair doesn't exist, just like we can make up, and I can make up a percentage about how many times it doesn't. Really, like, if I say it once a week, or 10 times a week, which is life really isn't fair. And that's a cliche for a reason. So like divorce isn't really fair. It's not really fair to your kids to tell them that they're going to be in 2 different houses. It's not really fair to tell your children that you're not going to sit next to their mom or their dad at their next sporting event or their next dance recital. It's not fair, but it's likely to happen. So the reality is, how do we make this good enough? And I think we do this by taking personal responsibility enough to hold on to enough of our voice to be able, with assistance, to talk to our soon-to-be ex in a way that we problem solve it together. There was one time when you liked this person. It might be very hard to remember when you're sitting there at the precipice of divorce, why you loved them, why you chose them. But 99%, completely made up, of relationships, people got married for love. We don't have arranged marriage anymore. We chose this person. Now they don't look the way we want them to look anymore, and that's disappointing. But we have to dig deep and be able to figure it out to make it fair enough for our children. Fair enough.
Fair enough.
Indeed. All right. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap this up, unless anybody else has anything else that they would like to add.
I think that's good enough.
Good enough for me.
All right. Very
By the
cool.
way, Jeremy, just not to like plug our services, but just to plug our services, we always offer a free consultation. And quite honestly, if we feel like our services could be helpful enough to get you ready to the next step, we'll tell you. And if we realize that from the beginning, you're not going to be able to figure out most of the issues and answer most of your questions, we'll tell you that too. Because we don't want it, quite honestly, we don't want to deal with a couple that we know we're not going to be able to help. So that's one thing. If people are listening and they want to call us, that we can talk to them and see if we'd be a good fit for them.
Sounds good. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for tuning in. If you like this content, don't forget to like, subscribe, all that fun stuff. If I could speak, we'd be in good shape. And what was your biggest takeaway from this episode? Let us know in the comments below. We're always interested in hearing your feedback. Until next time, everyone, take care. Have a wonderful day, and we will catch you next time on the next episode of Opportunity Costs.
Thank you for listening to Opportunity Costs. We hope today's episode provided you with valuable information. You do not have to go through this alone. We're here to provide a little entertainment and some potentially helpful insights. You can find more information on our website, indivorce.com. Be sure to subscribe, and until next time.